Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Joel Bryce, and welcome to another episode of Delta Waterfowl's The Voice of the Duck Hunter podcast. On today's episode, we'll take a close look at the profession of federal wildlife law enforcement, and then we'll talk about the North American Waterfowl Identification Field Guide that is available for purchase on Delta's website. The inspiration for this guidebook, coincidentally, came from the same wildlife officers who are guests on today's podcast. As you're listening to this podcast, I want you to imagine a scenario for me. Picture yourself driving along a quiet country road. With no one around, you give in to temptation and start reading a text message on your phone. In the distance, you notice an oncoming police car. Quickly, you check your speed limit and set your phone down and resume following the rules of the road as the officer passes by. This may seem small compared to the bad guy moments we see in the headlines, but moments like I just described benefit everyone on the road. This exact same scenario applies to the benefits we all receive from wildlife law enforcement. As a hunter, I was raised to follow game laws, but I must admit, when I see a warden in the field, I quickly run through a checklist in my mind to make sure I'm on the straight and narrow. Do I have enough orange on? Did I empty all the lead shells from my vest before going duck hunting? Do I have legal shooting hours at hand? And do I understand what my bag limit is? We as hunters and conservationists benefit tremendously from wildlife law enforcement, and odds are we don't give these benefits enough thought, nor provide wildlife officers their credit due. When I think of the work schedule of a wildlife officer, I can't help but think of my late uncle, Ron Anderson. Ron owned and operated a small town mom and pop bait shop. When everyone else was out fishing or hunting on opening day, Ron was tending the till, making sure everyone had the bait tackle and gear they needed. Eventually, Ron's personal passion for the out of doors took over. He closed his bait shop and took a real world job so he could hunt and fish on his own schedule. Joining me on today's podcast are two individuals whose commitment to wildlife conservation and protection are so strong. They set aside their personal passions of hunting and fishing to work bait shop hours as federal wildlife law enforcement officers. We all owe them a debt of gratitude. I'd like to introduce Rich Grosz and Pat Bosco. Welcome, guys.
Good morning.
Good morning. Awesome. So for people that are just listening to this, there is a version that's out on YouTube, so you can see these two crazy characters. I enjoy every minute that I spend talking with these guys, listening to them banter back and forth or give me grief. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I think everyone will too. So, Pat, you're in New York.
Yes.
Right. And Rich, unfortunately, you're right here in my hometown.
God's country, Bismarck.
God's country. That's right. That's right. Well, good. Well, so let's get a quick introduction to who you guys are. And so, Rich, we're going to start with you first. So your title is resident agent in charge. Help me describe this.
It's a first line supervisor for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement. I supervise special agents, and I also supervise wildlife inspectors up on the northern border. And currently I'm responsible for North and South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas.
That's a big territory.
It is very much a big territory.
You know, and for migratory birds, it's really important territory. And of course, most of the listeners to this podcast are avid waterfowlers. And so, you know, the work that you guys did and are doing for Rich, that's vital to, I think, everyone listening to this podcast. How many years on the job, Rich?
I'm coming up on 32 years officially. Although I followed my dad as a kid up into a young adult for a number of years before that, but officially employed by the Fish and Wildlife Service coming up on 32 years.
Excellent. That's a long time. And thank you. Thank you very much, Rich. Pat, you're retired.
Yes, I am.
And you had the similar job. How did your job compare to Rich's? Both at the federal level, right?
Yes. When I became a special agent with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I chose to stay as a special agent and not get into the supervisory end of things. So I was pretty much a field agent, and I would work my cases, you know, how they needed to be worked. So I never got into the supervisory role.
Okay.
But
how many years on the job, Pat?
I was an agent for over 28 years, but I got 33 years, 3 months with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service since 1978.
That's impressive. And, we'll get a little glimpse maybe at how your worlds have changed, but no doubt they've changed. The world changes every day and we change with it. So again, you're in New York. Is that where you worked at and also where you live now?
Well, when I got hired as an agent, I was stationed in Massachusetts, and this was started in August of 1988. From Massachusetts, my primary area as a field agent was Massachusetts. And then when we had an agent retire in Rhode Island, I also covered Rhode Island. It was myself and one other agent. And then we covered Maine for about 3 years when an agent retired there before they filled in behind him. So I was stationed in New England. And because it was only 1 or 2 people per state, I worked throughout New England and many times into New York State and then many times in other parts of the country.
That's probably a subject for another day, but there's not enough of you guys. It's such a huge territory. And of course, you can't be everywhere at once. And we'll bring in maybe some of the, Pat, you've told me how important hunters were to your job, and we can bring that in a little bit later, but it helps you be in more places than one. Rich, I want to get to know you. Pat, we're going to get to know you as well. Rich, tell me a little bit about where you're from, your upbringing, and then obviously you became, you chose wildlife law enforcement as your profession. How did that come to be? But start, where are you from? Tell me about yourself.
My official answer on where I'm from is wherever my house currently resides. And that's not a coy answer. I was born in Northern California, in the town of Eureka, behind the Redwood Curtain, for those folks that happen to know or are familiar with Northern California. My father at the time was getting his master's degree out of Humboldt State. And from there to start this lifelong quest, my father got employed by Cal Fish and Game. They've changed their name now, but at the time they were California Fish and Game as a game warden. From there, he was transferred down into the Central Valley of California. Another piece of God's country, especially if you're in the world of web feet, which my dad is or was, God rest his soul. Working still for California Fish and Game. From there, he got on with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and with law enforcement once again. He was a game management agent, which is a predecessor to what we are now. Obviously, as a kid, wherever mom and dad go, you go. So about every 2.5 years, we moved. And we went from, dad was stationed in Martinez. We lived in Colusa, California. From there, we came up to God's country, formerly today, which is Bismarck, North Dakota, back in the 70s. With every move, dad was progressing up the ladder within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we spent a couple years in Bismarck, and then we went to Virginia, where my dad went into headquarters, spent another 2.5 years there. He transferred out and became the assistant special agent in charge in the Twin Cities, where I lived in Prior Lake, Minnesota. From there, he competed for and was successful as the special agent in charge for Region 6, which is currently the region that I'm still working in. But that was in Denver, Colorado. We lived in Evergreen. I finished my high school in Evergreen, Colorado. My first college experience was at Metropolitan State in Denver, where I played basketball under scholarship for, at the time, a small D2 college. Enjoyed it immensely. And always had aspired ever since I was a little kid, literally a little kid, probably 6 or 7 years old, always aspired to be a game warden. It was something that I had had a chance to share with my father when I was young. Wish I had $1 for every hour I had ridden with him in the vehicle as a little kid growing up. I wouldn't have any money issues today, let's put it that way, if that were the case. Back then you could legally do it. Policy allowed it. Policy does not allow for that today as times have changed. But it was during that time, Joel, that I had a chance to see a lot of things. Both the old man getting into skirmishes or dust ups with people that were not following the law. Had a chance to watch him put bracelets on people that were not following the law. Had lots of exposures to different things, including Mother Nature. Had those opportunities that you get if you're a sports person, where you just know all of a sudden you're in the moment. And if your eyes and ears are open to it, all of a sudden you experience Mother Nature in a way that people outside of that environment can't experience. And I fell in love with Mother Nature. She became part of my life, basically, at a very young age, largely because of my father. With that in mind and idolizing what he was doing at the time, that became my vision quest. That I was of singular focus. It's all I wanted to be. I wanted to be a game warden. Didn't care if it was state, didn't care if it was federal. I wanted to get out and protect Mother Nature. And it's not that I'm anti-hunting. I love to hunt and fish and everything else, but I wanted to get in the middle of people that were trying to take illegally or unlawfully, were trying to take advantage of what she had to offer, both personally or commercially. So coming forward and trying to constantly focus my life into that effort, I went to Metropolitan State, got my bachelor's out of the way, went right back up to Humboldt State, where my dad had gotten his master's, and I got my master's in Humboldt State. With that, not to make a long story even longer, I got on with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a wildlife inspector at the Port of Los Angeles. I'm a huge country bumpkin. I love dirt between my toes, and I'm not much for asphalt and concrete and high rises. Don't particularly enjoy that. But that's what I had to do to get on with the agency. I did that for about 1.5 years. Did not enjoy living in LA. It's a great place if you're into the cities, but didn't enjoy much the experiences of LA, but I did enjoy the experiences of being a wildlife inspector at one of the busiest ports in the world. It advanced my career, especially with import and export, immensely in a very short period of time. It was a birth by fire. Was married, moved over into the Rocky Mountain Arsenal back to Denver, Colorado as a refuge officer. It's a different badge that the Fish and Wildlife Service offers. And I did that for about 4 years. And then a special agent vacancy announcement opened up. I jumped in, was lucky enough to be offered the position. And my first duty station was back in God's country again in Sacramento, California, back in the Central Valley. And had an immensely fun time there. From there was a vacancy announcement in Bismarck, North Dakota. And most people go, why on God's green earth would you ever want to go to Bismarck? You know, the place where it's either way too hot or way too cold, and there's no trees and there's no mountains and there's no coastal influence. You know, there's none of that. Well, I jumped when I saw that Bismarck opened up because I had been here as a kid. I knew what it had to offer for me and my family. I had 2 young children at the time. And I had a longing and want for, once again, dirt between my toes. I enjoy the resource. And in Bismarck, I knew I'd be 5 minutes from being away from everybody and back on the prairie. So I did that, got the job, and have been here since 1998. So it's a long time here, but 3 out of my 4 grandparents were born in North Dakota. The 4th grandparent was born in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. So I've lived in the mountains, I've lived on the coast, but a lot of my roots take me back to the prairie. So
it's a great place to be. And I like that Bismarck. I'd always say I like when people think about the North as this awful place to be, because one of the things that I think we love about it, Rich, I'll put words in your mouth, the lack of people, the abundance of natural resources and open spaces. It's pretty awesome. But that's a big journey, Rich, that you took. And, it's kind of the family business for you. It was something that your father did. You looked up to it. I see why. And you've dedicated your life to that as well. One little factoid, Pat, Rich, I think for those watching this, I think, Rich, you look like a big guy. So I don't think you're embarrassed by this. You're a big, intimidating individual. Your voice, for those just listening, yeah, he sounds like an intimidating guy. But I'm going to tell you, the first time I met you, Rich, I've never told you this, and I didn't think I was going to, but you embarrassed me because I went to shake your hand, and I've always thought I had a good handshake, but I couldn't get my hands around yours, and you squeezed my hand, and I didn't squeeze yours back, and I felt so unimpressive. And so thanks a lot for embarrassing me.
I'm normal size, Joel. I'm the runt of the litter with the men in the family on the Grosz side. And Pat goes back with my family decades, and he would understand that, having a lot of exposure with my father and my younger brother, I'm actually the runt of the family.
Yeah, that's, runt doesn't really apply to your family, so that's not okay. Hey, so we've talked about, you guys chose a difficult profession, one that involved sacrifice, no doubt. Rich, you said it. You're not one to talk about yourself, about your, let's say, your accomplishments very much. But you said you had a moment you wanted to be in this field so badly that you turned aside 2 offers that a lot of people would like to have. You said that you were invited to try out for the Denver Nuggets.
Yeah, coming out of college, I was invited for tryouts with the Denver Broncos and the Denver Nuggets, and turned it down to go and pursue my master's degree, so that I would be more competitive when I finally threw my hat in the ring to become an agent with the Fish and Wildlife Service.
That's dedication. It is, to give up those opportunities, even to say you tried it. Pat, we're going to switch over to you. Rich sets the bar high. Don't worry. It's your turn. Tell us about and Rich kind of showed me, you have a unique background in the sense of choosing wildlife law enforcement as a profession. Where are you from? Tell me a little bit about that career path that you went through.
Well, I'm from East Patchogue, Long Island, New York, which is just about halfway out on the island from New York City, between New York City and Montauk, on the South Shore. That's where I'm born and raised. So my interest in wildlife began with my father and my grandmother. My father was a hunter. My grandmother on my mom's side, which is the German side. So I have a little German in me, Rich. So hopefully I didn't embarrass you. But my dad being a hunter, waterfowl, small game, deer, things like that. And my grandmother feeding birds, things like that. I always had, as a young boy, very big interest in wildlife. When I got of age to hunt, go with my dad, that even picked up even more. So like Rich at an early age, all I wanted to do was be a New York State conservation officer. That's what they were called back in the day. It's a different title today. So I kind of set up my pace through life to get to that goal. Unfortunately, my dad was a businessman, had a lot of businesses. So working the family businesses, which was greenhouses, sanitation industry, and all sorts of things like that. My dad wanted to set me up in business. That's where the money was. I wanted to work for the local county parks department. So I sacrificed not making the big money with business, but working as a civil servant. So I started that part-time into full-time in 1973. Reason I wanted to be in the Park Service, because I was around wildlife, trees, lakes, fishing, hunting type stuff. Though my first title was laborer as a civil servant, I kind of managed, the park liked me because of my interest, I kind of managed their hunting program after a while. We had a waterfowl hunting program on the Carmen's River, which is part of, on Long Island. So this was local. That began my interest. I was a waterfowl hunter to begin with, but it began my interest in teaching people how to identify waterfowl because of the hunt I ran there. We can get back to that later on. From the county park service, parks department, I eventually got the opportunity to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It was a 1-year term. It was not permanent, in other words, it's full time. And it was for the adjacent piece of land that was owned by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's called Wertheim National Wildlife Refuge, which actually bordered the Great South Bay. And it was the southern part of the Carmen's River. The man that wanted to hire me for that 1-year term, Dominic Ciccone, great guy. I was so excited, man, I'm going to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That whole term just meant so much to me. Well, at the same time, the county was offering me full-time permanent position, which my father thought I was nuts not accepting that to go to a part-time thing with U.S. Fish and Wildlife for that 1-year term. As a naive kid, the county official said, Pat, you know what? That sounds like a great thing. We know what your interests are. If it doesn't work out, come back, we'll rehire you. So with the permanent job. So I told my father that. So, what are you, crazy? These politicians will tell you anything. And I believed it. So I did my 1 year in the wildlife refuge as a laborer. That's where I met the individuals that were called special agents. I didn't know what that was at the time, that term. So Dominic put it in a layman's term. Pat, that's the federal game wardens. Well, when I met those guys, that's all I wanted to do in my life. So from that point on, now I got to meet some of these guys. From that point on, my whole focus was to get to that position if I could do it. When my year ran out, I got hired by the Suffolk County Parks Department full time. That was a miracle, at least to my father's way of thinking. From there, I kept applying to all federal jobs. Unfortunately, I did not go to college. I don't have a degree. I'm pretty much self-taught with wildlife, but I was going to night school. I graduated high school and that. I was going to night school at Suffolk County Community College, trying to get credits, but I was always working. So I kept working. I didn't want to quit a job to get a degree to come back to that same job. At the time, this is the way I was thinking. So I continued through. Well, lo and behold, I had an opportunity in 1984. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service offered me a full-time permanent job as a wildlife inspector. You heard Rich speak about wildlife inspector position already. I took that wholeheartedly. I resigned from the county on good standing, took that position because now I'm within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I thought, man, this could be a great stepping stone to become a special agent. I was stationed, well, Rich will laugh, what I consider God's country, JFK, New York, at the airports. That's where I was.
That
a
doesn't
wildlife
sound like God's country, but we can take your word for it.
Well, the reason I say that is because working as a wildlife inspector through air cargo in New York City, I was exposed to more live, dead, parts, pieces of critters from all over the world, more so than most of your famous explorers. So it was a hell of a learning experience. I was there for almost 4 years before I got selected as a special agent. My big hang up was I didn't have a degree. So it was tough to get to the selecting officials because that was a mark against me not having a degree. But eventually I prevailed. They did hire me. So it was May 8th of 1988, I became a special agent stationed in Boston, Massachusetts. From there, working in Boston, New England, pretty much. At one time, my partner at the time, Chris Dowd, he's also retired. We covered Massachusetts and Rhode Island because we had a vacancy there. And then for about 3 years, vacancy in Maine, and we covered that as our primary areas. But because we're in such low numbers, we helped our fellow agents, state officers all over the place. So in 2001, I transferred from the Boston office to Vermont, and I covered Vermont, and for several years, New Hampshire as well, because there was a vacancy there at the time. It's filled now. So my primary field experience for my primary area of work was New England, basically. But like I say, we've worked throughout the country and Canada, Rich and I as well. But that's pretty much how I got to the special agent thing. And then in July of 2014, when I hit the magic age of 57, that's a mandatory retirement age for federal agents for the most part. So the end of July that year, I stayed right till the last day I could possibly work as a special agent. So since then, I've been retired, residing in upstate New York in the Catskill Mountains. And I still work as a contractor for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, mostly in teaching. I still assist Rich teaching down at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. I also participate in the international trainings that we have, where we actually go out and teach international game wardens, basic skills. So I'm still a part of the team, so to say. So since late 1977 till now, I'm still involved with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thank you both for sharing with us, your path, from thinking about the career to obtaining the career. Pat, thanks for your service. Rich, we're not going to ask how old you are. We're not going to talk what's looming in your life, but I think Pat said something about 57. So, unfortunately or fortunately, it sounds like you can see the end. But again, thank you guys so much. I think what I want to do too is, I think as a hunter or a fisherman, or our listeners, they're probably most familiar with state game wardens. And I think there's this curtain maybe in front of federal special agents as you guys are talking there. It sounds really exciting. I don't think many people really know what that is. Rich, do you want to tackle this, or what's the difference primarily between state and federal wildlife law enforcement? Where does one start and the other one end?
Let me take a step back, Joel, before I go forward. The Fish and Wildlife Service offers 3 different badges. And so people may be familiar with 1 or 2, probably not all 3 badges. And then I'll come into the State Conservation Officer question. Within the Office of Law Enforcement, where I'm housed right now, where I'm stationed right now, we have the special agent, which we've talked about, Pat and I, and then we've also touched on our wildlife inspector position. Mm-hmm. Our wildlife inspector positions are typically stationed at large international ports like Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Miami. And then they're also stationed primarily along the borders, both north and south. Generally speaking, there's some other places like DHL and some of these international hubs where we also have inspectors stationed. Their primary focus is import-export, what's coming in and what's going out of the country that's dealing with wildlife. So That is a second badge that the Fish and Wildlife Service offers. The third badge, which most people that hunt and fish are probably a little more familiar with, are our federal wildlife officers, formerly refuge officers. That badge is housed within the Division of Refuges, different than the Office of Law Enforcement, but still within the same umbrella of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And their primary responsibilities are located on refuges and other federal properties within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, like waterfowl production areas, and there's a number of other properties that they enforce both conservation laws and they enforce other laws that we commonly associate with sheriffs of the county and things of that nature. So those are the three badges that people may have encountered if they're out in the field, doing whatever they're doing. When you come back to your question now at point, Joel, state conservation officers, and they come by various titles depending on the state you're in. It depends on state by state because every state's got, their own different statutes and what they require of those people. But one of the primary responsibilities that they have is to enforce the state's conservation laws, not the federal laws, the state's conservation laws. So that will typically include your resident wildlife, which are your deer, turkeys, pheasants, grouse, things of that nature. They also enforce laws that overlap federal laws, like the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, where they're enforcing waterfowl regulations within their state. And that's typically where state officers and federal officers, meaning in this case, federal wildlife officers and agents, that's where we have some overlap and where we talk to each other, we help each other. Basically, we're in the best case scenario, basically we're in each other's hip pocket. And so we're talking, not only are we friends on the professional level, in many cases we're friends on the personal level, and we help each other out. So there are more state conservation officers, hands down, within the United States than there are U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, federal wildlife officers and agents combined. It's not even close.
Okay.
We're spread far and thin. So if that answers your question.
I think it does. Pat, I want to ask you, so I imagine that one of the biggest differences tends to be jurisdiction. So I would imagine if something covers a region, or if we're talking about migratory birds, Pat, is that where things tend to fall in your lap, where an incident from one state spills into the other, or if you're dealing with migratory birds or international game or products, is that where you guys take over?
Yes, because as special agents working within the federal government, our jurisdiction is nationwide in our territories and possessions as well. So when we're working waterfowl and we have a dual thing with the states, we work together. Many times our state wildlife officers will come up with a lot more contacts and a lot more information and intelligence that they bring to us when they need some kind of specific help with usually migratory birds. We're deemed and looked at as the experts in that field. So they'll come to us for that and we'll work together that way. Another way that we interact, because our jurisdiction is much wider, is with people who you have a violator that, say, lives in New Jersey, comes to New York State, takes an animal illegally, whether it's a duck or a deer or a turkey or whatever, transports any part of that animal back to New Jersey, crossing state lines. Then our state counterparts kind of rely on us to help them with their investigations when they find out, hey, subject number one shot a deer illegally, out of season, whatever, early, late. but he transported back to New Jersey. It's out of our jurisdiction. And we would go with our agents in those states, or we'd go ourselves and help them with interviews and try to help the state make their case. There are federal laws violated. It's called the Lacey Act, which federally we could charge them, even though it's animals that we're not really charged with protecting, like deer, turkey. But generally, we give all that information to the states, help them make that case. That's another way that we interact with our state officers more times than not, and internationally as well. If somebody goes over to South Africa and violates one of their wildlife laws, and again, transports anything back, imports it into the United States, that also triggers the Lacey Act. We can help our foreign counterparts as well.
So you guys have some, obviously you have experiences with that international law.
Oh yeah, both Rich and I, and every agent out there, is always international stuff going on. And especially as wildlife inspectors, even backing up before we became special agents, we were pretty much enforcing a lot of international laws at that point as well, because things were coming in from all over the world.
So that's where would you chalk a lot of that under the category smuggling?
Yes, smuggling was a big thing, and it was, permit compliance, more lesser type stuff. Permits didn't match what they were bringing in, but smuggling, all out smuggling, completely hiding, let's say in a pet industry, completely hiding some protected species of animal that they want in, knowing they can't legally bring it in. Yes, we get the traditional type smuggling as well. And the agents would usually take that case over from the wildlife inspectors, if that happens.
That's interesting. Later on this year, we're going to bring you guys back on, and we're just going to indulge everyone.
There's so much.
Yeah, I can't even imagine it. It kind of blows my mind. But again, I told you guys before that the overwhelming majority of listeners on this podcast, Delta Waterfowl members, followers, they're waterfowl hunters. Of course, they hunt other things, but would I be accurate in saying if they want to thank someone when we're talking about migratory birds, ducks, geese, I mean, that's you guys, it's your jurisdiction, right? And again, because it's absolutely a state wildlife officer has jurisdiction inside that state, but the fact that birds migrate, people travel, thank goodness that there are special agents that can have a larger jurisdiction.
No, you're absolutely right. And don't forget, if you want to thank people, you thank your state wildlife officers, but you also have to thank our biologists and our technicians. And there's so much that goes into maintaining healthy waterfowl populations, and the research that goes into it, and the way they set the seasons. And there's so many surveys that it's a big effort. Rich and I and our wildlife state counterparts, we really come into play when people aren't abiding by what the researchers and the biologists and the technicians have deemed appropriate to set these season limits and bag limits and things like that. We come in to enforce the regulations that are implemented by the state and federal agencies involved. So, but it is to thank, there's a lot of people to thank, they should thank you just for having us on, so people might be learning something from us, So there's a lot more to it. But look, as law enforcement, yes, you can certainly thank your law enforcement officers that work that resource and work it well. Yes.
Rich, you look like you had something you wanted to say there.
Well, I was going to say, Joel, an analogy would be, I would liken it, it's not apples to apples, but it's close. I would liken it to our veterans and our people that are currently serving the country in a military way. It doesn't matter which branch, which arm of the service it is. We should all be thankful for their service, both past as well as present and future. Pat's right. Law enforcement is but one tool in an effective program to manage wildlife. Mm-hmm. And if, law enforcement could do whatever they wanted, but if you don't have the biologists that are doing their part and the researchers doing their part, it gets out of balance. So there are many voices that go into this collective program, if you will. We're just one ingredient to that group of people. We're just one entry, one voice into that. It's important that we do what we do. Obviously, we've given the most productive years of our life to that cause, to that vision quest. But if you had biologists on this podcast today, they would say I think the same thing. They're given the most productive years of their lives to this one particular thing that they're following, that they strongly believe in. But it's a collective thing that has to be done together. Yeah. Otherwise it doesn't work.
Well, you guys get to be modest, but I can heap it on. I think most biologists or wildlife managers, like myself, there was a time early in my development of what do I want to do, and I always wanted to be in conservation. Always. There was never a question ever, but there was that moment, the fork in the road, where I said, do I want to be in law enforcement or do I want to be a manager or biologist? And I chose the manager or biologist. This wasn't part of my mentality, but let's just say it like it is. I chose the safer route. And so you guys have picked it's one of the most dangerous professions out there for so many reasons. And stating the obvious, you're out in a marsh, you're out in the woods, you're in rural areas, and you're dealing with people, whether they're doing right or wrong. One of the things they mostly have in common is they're carrying some type of a firearm, at least in a hunting situation. And so it is. And so again, I do think it's important and it's impressive that you guys chose that. And Rich, you have this quote. I always get it wrong, but read it to me. What's your quote that's on your email signature?
The credit goes to my father for this, but it's wildlife dies without a sound. The only voice it has is yours.
Yeah. And so again, thanks guys. I know you didn't come on here for me to keep telling you thank you, but forgive me if I say it a few more times. One thing I love about these podcasts is, I try to think of what can our listeners learn, but I learn things at the same time. And I knew this was the case, but I really didn't put it all together. Jurisdiction is really important. And Pat, that idea, that example you gave of an infraction in one state and that person traveling to another, the federal layer. I mean, obviously that's why there's fewer of you. You cover larger territory, but it allows the Lacey Act. It's so important that you cross the state line. You didn't get away with something yet, right? It's you're always in someone's jurisdiction. Rich, Pat, you guys both said, Pat, you worked at New England. Rich, you worked most recently you're here in the Great Plains, but you must have worked on assignment in other parts of the country as well, right?
You asking me?
Either one.
Go ahead, Pat. Run with it.
Thank you, Rich. I'll tell you this. My facts may be a little bit off because I don't have numbers in front of me. I've worked, I think, in every single state in the United States, maybe bar one or two. Probably did things there as well. Also, most provinces in Canada, and I pretty much could speak for Rich on this as well. And not only overtly, on overt cases, helping states with Lacey Act and stuff like that, but covertly as well. Both Rich and I were very, very sought after to work in an undercover capacity. That's a whole nother 10 podcasts if you want. So we got to go almost everywhere. And if your investigation, especially today, took you to a foreign country, though we don't have jurisdiction outside the United States jurisdiction, many of our agents do travel for advice, educational, helping the other foreign countries make that case that involves both the United States and whatever other countries are involved. So there is literally the opportunity to travel worldwide, not just internationally, not just nationally within the United States. It just depends on the circumstances of the investigations.
That's impressive. And again, I do think that's Rich, we've pulled back the curtain a little bit and getting a glimpse into the profession. In my intro, I made some reference to bait shop hours, and that was my uncle. I remember hearing it. He was scooping bait, selling ammo while everyone else was out there hunting. And that bait shop hours, does that fit you guys?
Let me tell you this. It takes a tremendous amount of work ethic to be a special agent. The hours are unbelievable. Luckily, in my upbringing, and I can speak for Rich as well, the hours I put in working for the family and other things gave me the skills to work long. I mean, literally, Rich and I could be up for 30, 40 hours straight, just depending on what you're in. So the hours were tremendous. And we didn't get paid for all those hours. There was a lot of personal commitment to this and a lot of time not spent with family and friends, and like what most people will do. So there is a lot of hours. So when you say bait shop hours, whatever that meant, with that and more. So, and it does take away from your personal hunting, fishing, and outdoor activities, because usually when you're working waterfowl or helping your state counterparts with Lacey Act big game, that all takes place during the hunting season. And because we're so busy and we're all in low numbers, even the states are kind of in low numbers when you think about it, we have to work all the time. So it did take away from the personal hunting, but it didn't matter. That was our goal, was to help protect the wildlife.
Well, if someone really smart, and I wish I could shake their hand, I don't remember who they were, but the first time I heard, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. And I think all three of us are blessed in that regard. Rich, this has been exciting and inspiring for me. If someone listening to this is at a point in their life where they do have an opportunity to steer their career path towards, a federal wildlife officer, what's the typical career path? And there probably isn't one, but I'm going to ask you to try to come up with a typical.
A college education, 4-year degree helps. Obviously keeping yourself out of trouble with the law certainly helps. The competition for these jobs is intense, is the easiest way to put it. A lot of people apply, very few get it. So if you do apply and you're not successful the first time or the second time or the third time, don't get frustrated. Keep working toward diversifying your base as far as exposures that you have. Obviously, when you have few jobs and lots of applicants, it allows the agency to pick the cream of the crop, and that's just what happens. But you have to work at it. You have to have a little bit of luck. The more inline type of exposure you can get in your other jobs before you come across it helps. If you've got wildlife exposure at the state or federal level in law enforcement, that helps. If you've got a foreign language capability, especially today, because we are going more international today, the agency is Office of Law Enforcement, that helps. You have to look at yourself critically and honestly and say, where can I improve? Where can I be better? Where can I make myself more competitive? And being honest with yourself is one thing, and then trying to achieve that goal. How do I take care of the shortcoming that I may have, be it a second language, be it more exposure to things that are in line or in kind with what the special agent does today? That's just going to make you more competitive. And then obviously, like I said, if you don't get it the first time or the second time, don't give up hope. You have to stay diligent and just continue to pursue it. Keep chasing it down.
Anything you'd add to that, Pat?
Rich hit it on the nose, and I would emphasize, be honest with yourself, because when you get involved in law enforcement, in the wildlife world, it's going to take a lot out of you as far as physically, mentally, time spent away. It is a lot involved. Unfortunately, people out there, well, game warden, it sounds sexy. They see a few pictures of us every once in a while. Rich and I might be holding some cute little animal we had to seize or save or something. That's such a small percentage of what goes on. So, I don't want people thinking that it's, we're cuddling all these little furry, little friendly looking things. There's a lot of, as a hunter, it's one thing, we dispatch an animal, you know how to do it. But when you're in the world of wildlife enforcement, you're going to see some ugly things, and you're going to see some ugly people. And I don't mean that literally by looks. It really, you have to be a special person to deal with it all and not take it personally, and treat everybody fairly. You're going after these bad guys, but there's so much more to it. And that's pretty much like all law enforcement to an extent. But, that I would add that. But Rich hit it on the nose. I mean, he's the best at explaining things.
Yeah, I dip back into kind of my high school when you said, Pat, it's not all exciting, right? It's not all cute and cuddly animals, and it's not all edgy. There is kind of a boring part of law enforcement. I remember when I was in high school, I told you guys, I always knew what I wanted to do ever since 8th grade. And then, so I sought out some ride-alongs with the local game warden, with the local biologists, and the game warden. I remember, I wish I could remember his name. It'd be important for me to drop that if I could, but he scheduled the ride along, and he says, Joel, everybody thinks being a game warden's all this fun, exciting stuff. He goes, I'm going to show you the not so fun side. And I spent a whole day in court with him. And I was expecting all these people to show up, and nobody showed up. So my entire day with the game warden was sitting in a courtroom with no violators showing up to basically defend or dispute their tickets. So yeah, there's a bunch of paperwork there too. One of you guys, Pat, I know you said it, but to share the mic, or maybe you both can take a turn. We're all hunters, right? And so we're talking to hunters, mostly, hopefully there's a few law enforcement officers listening, but Pat, you told me the value of a hunter to your profession, that it would have been hard for you to do your job or do it as well without hunters being involved. What do you mean by that?
Absolutely. We work a myriad of investigations. It's not just hunting and fishing related, but when it comes to hunting and fishing related or trapping related industries that we happen to be working violations in, some of the best intelligence, some of the best help we can get is from the people that are utilizing the resource themselves, the hunter, the trapper, the fisherman. And it's usually the honest ones. It's the ones that, I've had it. And I need to report this. Unfortunately, people say, oh, you can't be a rat. You can't tell us. Well, it's got nothing to do with that. If you know a violation went on and you don't report it, you're just a bigger part of the problem as the guy that committed the violation. This is when I get on my lectures to the general public. Our hunters, our honest fishermen, hunters, and trappers, however you want to put it, when they come to us for help, because there's so many eyes and ears out there from that hunting fraternity. It's some of the best help we can ever get. They see what's going on. Rich and I could be walking around for days. We only got one set of eyes, one set of ears. Oh, we finally find something. But with all the hunters out there, and all the fishermen, and we can go on even beyond that, bird watchers and everything else, they're the ones that are going to see more violations than the actual officer. When they come to us and at least point us in the right direction, it could be anonymous, doesn't matter. That is such a big help. One of the reasons I got involved with wildlife law enforcement beyond any other type of law enforcement is what I was seeing, what I was exposed to, friends, relatives, and that kind of thing, and what I was seeing as a hunter or fisherman going on out there that really started to get to me. That's the kind of law enforcement I wanted. I never wanted to be a police officer, a street cop, a state police officer. That wasn't in my interest. When it came to wildlife, that's what sent me to the law enforcement end. I love the biological end. I love all of that kind of stuff. And I help those divisions out greatly when I can. And they help me as well. I know I got off on a tangent, but hunters are so important. And not just hunters, taxidermists, picking facilities. When people come to us, that's our core area of really seeing what's going on out there. So I can leave it at that. I mean, it's
no, I think that's really important, Rich. I think I agree. Hunters are out there on the landscape. They recognize things that are out of place. Rich, I would imagine that sometimes when someone has to provide a tip of what's going on, a lot of times maybe they feel like they're betraying someone, that it's someone that they know, which maybe that's the situation. Rich, can you talk about the importance of kind of overcoming that and we all play a role, not just you guys?
Sure. Wildlife dies without a voice. The only voice it has is yours. That's eloquently and simply put, in my opinion. If it doesn't bother you that things like that are happening, then you're not part of the solution. You're probably part of the problem. If a person knows or suspects or has a hunch or is being bothered by something internally that says something's not right here, or I know something's wrong here. The Fish and Wildlife Service has a tip line. Every state in the country, as far as I know, has a tip line of one form or fashion. Just call.
You want those tips, right? You want them.
Yes. I'm 2 eyes and 2 ears, as Patsy alluded to. One of the reasons why Pat and I teach is because we take our 4 eyes and 4 ears and try to teach it to the masses, because it enhances the ability to detect things that are wrong. The public, be it the recreational public or even the general public, if they think something's amiss, report it. Let the law enforcement folks, state, local, federal, tribal, international, just depending on where it's at, let us figure it out. And it can be anonymous. In some cases, if someone wants to get paid for their information, there are avenues for that under certain circumstances. But let us figure it out. We don't need to expose or involve that person. But if we don't know about it, how can we try to stop it? So one person is one person. Mm-hmm. If people are communicating back to us, or when Pat and I teach, it's a force multiplier is what it is. It's allowing what we know to become a bigger deterrent. And at the end of the day, wildlife dies without a sound. The only voice it has is yours. And that's, Pat and I obviously have a badge on our chest, or had a badge on our chest, because we felt strongly enough about it. The American public, in the case of this podcast, it has to resonate enough with them internally to where they're willing to stand, albeit not with a badge, but they have to stand for something, because it's just wrong. It's just wrong. We're not taking the resource away from us. We're taking the resource away from our kids and our grandkids and future generations to come. So when you put it into that type of a perspective, I think it's easy for maybe me to go, well, I can live with it. It's okay. But now if my kids or my grandkids are going to have an opportunity taken away from them because of something that's going on today, I'm going to stand up in front of that a whole lot faster. Mm-hmm. Because I don't want them to lose that experience, to lose that moment, not to have that chance happen like I've had it happen to me. So just report it. Just report it.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I think we can all do our part. And I think everyone probably listening can think back into some moment where maybe they should have said something, or maybe you did. And if you did, congrats and keep it up. I do want to switch gears here. And for those of you watching this podcast, there's far more listening. What I have in my hand, it's called the North American Waterfowl Identification Guide. This was a cooperative project between Delta Waterfowl and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's an amazing book. But I'm going to switch this over to Pat. Pat, I remember I received the call. I think it was 2012, 13, something like that. And I said, remember, hey, Joel, we have this great idea for a duck ID book. There's a lot of us in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, law enforcement, we teach duck ID. And I was like, where do you teach duck ID? And I remember, well, we teach other officers, we teach trainees how to identify ducks. And it really caught me off guard. We can be too close to our own life sometimes. And as a lifelong waterfowler, yeah, we can identify ducks at a distance based on silhouette and wing beat patterns and where they are and where they aren't. And there's, whether you could be the most avid hunter in the world, have never hunted waterfowl and become a wildlife officer, and you're going to need some tips on how to identify ducks. And so you guys used this methodology to teach others how to identify ducks. Pat, can you talk about that?
Oh, absolutely. When it comes to the world of waterfowl, there's many species, and you may hear hunters commonly complain, well, there's so many laws and regulations, and there's so many ducks. How do I know? And I just simply say, well, be honest with yourself. What duck can you identify? And I'll add, and I'll tell them, do you know what a mallard is? Most waterfowl hunters say, well, of course. A wood duck, of course. Canada goose, of course. What other ducks do you know specifically? And many times they'll add a few more and they're not sure. I said, well, think about this. If you make a mistake at what you're shooting, you don't know if it's an animal you're allowed to take or not allowed to take. So if you're afraid if you can't identify something, don't shoot. And if you want to shoot more species, you need to learn that. Mm-hmm. This is a hunter, like you want to know what it is before you pull the trigger. You can get in trouble. That's on the hunter's end. He could subject himself to a fine or loss of license or incarceration because he don't know. When it comes to the wildlife officers that are out there enforcing the compliance with the laws that are set in the waterfowl world, if the officer doesn't know how to identify all the critters, all the species of waterfowl, or the look-alike species, how is he going to be effective in getting compliance with these regulations? So when you become a wildlife officer, one of your classes sooner or later is going to be in migratory game bird and or waterfowl identification, as well as fish ID and all of that stuff. But when it comes to the birds, because we're interested right now in waterfowl, we need to be able to get all the wildlife officers, not just the special agents of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We also want our state officers to know their wildlife ID, because they're doing a lot of this work as well. Mm-hmm. So when I got on as a special agent, I know I'm going on tangents, and if I'm confusing you, stop me and we'll back up, because if I confuse you, I'm going to confuse the public.
I got you. I'm with you.
Okay. back when I started, when I told you I started with the Suffolk County Parks, Recreation, and Conservation, I was a laborer. And I ran a waterfowl hunt for the agency. The park rangers didn't run it. They were my law enforcement branch. If I had a violation, I'd call them in. But they had no interest in running the hunt. So I ran the hunt. What I was finding was a lot of the individuals that would come in really didn't know their identification. Some of them were great. Some of them were mediocre. Some didn't know anything. So I took it upon myself to start a small identification thing prior to the hunt commencing. It was a drawing hunt. You had to be there a certain time. Everybody throws their name in the hat type of deal. And I would show movies or videos of ducks and try to educate people. That started it. And I used to borrow the footage from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, like I told you across the way, the Wertheim National Wildlife Refuge. And I used to utilize what they had. And I had pamphlets to hand out to people. The old, the little
Ducks
duck
at a
idea.
distance.
Thank you, Rich. My brain doesn't work so good. I'm getting old. The ducks at a distance guides, I'd hand them out to people. That started my interest in, not only do we need to educate the hunters, we also need to educate the officers, because the park rangers relied on me, the laborer, to tell them if there is a violation. So now that started myself. And then when I got on as a special agent and met Rich's dad, Terry, for the first time, and I went through his dad's class, he taught the waterfowl identification course for many years prior. And when I took that course, there's a lot of stories to this, but that's when I met Mr. Grosz, mountain of a man. And when I went through that class, Rich, I know there's a lot of stories swirling around your mind. I sat there, and my fellow agents, some who I knew, there were other wildlife inspectors who happened to get selected at the same time. Some were refuge officers, but I was meeting guys for the first time, and we're all getting to know each other during this training down at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia. I realized a lot of these guys have no clue about waterfowl ID. So I thought I had a little experience in it at the time, so I started to help Rich's dad, and his dad picked up that, you see, Bosco's helping out these guys that are really struggling with it, because I didn't want my fellow cadets at the time to fail the test, because it was an extensive test. So when we got done with that training, Rich's father came to me and said, Mr. Bosco, and I know I can't speak as low as he did. I'd like you to help me with the next class and the next class on. So I got involved with Rich's dad in 1988. And from then until his dad retired, taught down at it took over for Terry when he retired, but I helped his dad the whole time on future classes. While we were doing that, and then Rich came on the scene. Rich, I forget what year. You were in diapers when I started.
95, Pat.
Okay, so now Rich comes on the scene. He's in his special agent basis class. I'm with his dad teaching. One of the things we teach was the waterfowl identification course. So I get to know Rich very well. And from then on in, when Rich's dad retired, Rich and I took over that course. But what we both saw as we were coming through, even with the knowledge we had, but specifically seeing how other people were really having a problem, even with some of the most common species of waterfowl, we said, there's got to be a better way to present this, to help them out. So Rich, his dad, and I just started formulating in our heads, there's got to be a methodology. Now, there's other identification books out there. There's other keys that people use to identify waterfowl and all. And we've looked at that and we've utilized them in our own way. But we needed to come up with something better because we saw the officers struggling with this. And mind you, this is mostly in-hand identification. For an officer to come to a compliance check of, say, a duck blind, waterfowl hunter, and there's a pile of ducks on the ground. And if he doesn't know what's there, we had to give him a tool to use where even if everything fell out of his head, what he learned in training, that he could pick up a duck. And if he followed this method that we eventually came up with all our collective way of thinking over the years, he'd be successfully able to identify the species that he had in hand. Therefore, being successful in identifying if we do have a violation or we don't have a violation. That was our goal. So as the years progressed with me, people always suggested, Pat, we need to put something into a book form. I wasn't that talented. And eventually, Rich kicked me in the butt. We got off our collective butts and put the method we came up with into what is now the book you held up to show your listeners. And the rest is history from there. Now, I know, Joe, you want to talk more about the book. I went off on a tangent, so bring me back on track here.
Oh, no, that's a good tangent because I think the story is really important. And I think what stood out to me, I remember when I received that call and it was a pitch. Hey, this is a revolutionary method of keying out ducks quickly in the field or the classroom. And it didn't take me very long, but it did stand out. After I thought about it, it made sense. Not everyone can identify ducks in law enforcement, and I get that. So what you guys were thinking is, yeah, this would be a tool in the hands of wildlife officers so they can do it right. But then what's fair is let's put that, this was an obvious appeal to Delta as the duck hunters organization, as we call ourselves. Well, let's put that great idea into the hands of duck hunters. So it didn't take me but a moment to think, yeah, this is something we want to do. And I'm going to, again, this Rich, Pat, this goes back to Rich, your dad, Terry, and you guys. But I'm going to, what's impressive about this is, yeah, I have a ton of bird books, right? And you flip through them and there's a duck section and a songbird section. And there are at times color coding to those guidebooks. But what I love about this one, and I'm going to use, this book covers 47 species of ducks, geese, and swans in North America. And each page covers so much, but it's all practical information. But let's say I'm a new hunter and I'm scared to go hunting because I'm worried about the complex regulations. I want to do it right, but I don't know where to start. And so obviously the most effective way of making sure you're following the laws are to identify that bird on the wing. And that's tough. That becomes a bit of an art form. Even videos aren't going to help you out. And so I think a lot of people coming up through, the ranks of novice to avid waterfowl hunter, at some point, if you look back, you identified your ducks, some number of your ducks in the hand. And so that's really what this guide is. And so you harvest a bird. Hopefully you knew what it was already. But if not, you're legal to shoot one duck and you start there. And you positively identify it by looking at one of two things. And that's one is the color of the speculum. And so if you're thinking of a mallard, that's that bluish, purplish band on its wing. That's the speculum. All ducks have a speculum. And the other thing to look at is the hind toe on the duck's foot. And I guess I would use the analogy of like a dew claw on a dog. That's kind of the same feature, I guess, what I would think of when I look at a duck's foot. And you look at that and say, is that toe lobed or is it not lobed? Does it have webbing or does it not have webbing? And if it has webbing, it's a diver. And if it doesn't have webbing, it's a dabbler. And so you look at those two things, and anybody with the right mindset can take any duck, look at those two things. And so this guide covers 47 species. If it has a white speculum and it has a non-lobed hind toe, guys, there's only one duck that it can be. It's the gadwall. And this key, and again, if you can't see it, go to our website and check it out. But it's amazing. And so the other thing too, if it has a blue speculum and a lobed hind toe, it can only be 2 species. And there's 2 species of divers that can be. It's either a harlequin or a Steller's eider. If it's blue speculum, non-lobed hind toe, there's only 5 species of ducks it can be. And so you go to those pages, it shows the drake and the hen. It shows, the beautiful, breeding season plumage, and it shows the more dull molting plumage or eclipse plumage. And so to me, it's amazing. There's range maps, and it's a hunting season range map. So you guys really had this thing perfected, and it's so cool. And again, I'm lucky I have a copy in my hand, and it is intended to take with you anywhere you want. You can take it in, throw it into your blind bag. It's waterproof, tear resistant, blood-proof paper. I mean, this is something to take out there. And so whether you're considering taking up duck hunting for the first time, or you'd like to sharpen up your duck ID skills, this is amazing. It's a great gift idea. Gift yourself, get yourself a birthday present, buy one for someone a new hunter. The other thing that, we do offer, as a group here, we offer discount pricing. So I think that the hope was that, an entire state agency, or a state agency would buy one of these books for every one of their wardens or conservation officers, or universities would use this. Pat, anything you want to add about just kind of did I miss anything about I'm going to say, brilliance of this particular system?
Well, Joel, you said it is as good or better than Rich and I could have said it. It is a system that over the years, and Rich and I have seen thousands and tens of thousands, and his dad, of parts and pieces and live ducks, dead ducks, and you name it. And we came up with this method. In other words, it took what was a complicated thing, didn't make it necessarily easy. It made it as easy as the complicated thing could be made, at least from our set of eyes. Maybe sometime in the future, someone comes up with something even better. But I'd be hard pressed to see someone do that. So we put this into a book form. We used to just teach it out of our heads. And then we finally put it into book form, because Delta Waterfowl was so great and wanted to partner up with us that Rich and I were ecstatic when that happened. So the book goes from the general characteristics to more specific characteristics. So we take a duck in hand, again, in hand, and I'll go beyond that in a minute. And where we start with these 47 species is, like you said, we start with the foot. And why do we start with the foot? Why wouldn't we just start with the wing or whatever? The foot, and this is just to give the listener an idea of how we go from general to specific. So we start at the foot. All waterfowl, with only one, I think, exception, all waterfowl have 3 toes forward, webbing in between those 3 toes, and the little hind toe, the dew claw, like you put it, it's the best way to put it. If you pick up a bird and it doesn't have 3 toes forward with the webbing, you probably don't have a duck to begin with. So that, believe it or not, that's a very big thing for the wildlife officer. Of course, we have a lot of look-alike species. If it looks like a duck, flies like a duck, therefore it's a duck. That's the untrained person would think. For example, I could speak for Rich. I could speak for every special agent and state warden who's ever worked waterfowl hunts. Sooner or later in their career, they come into that duck blind or the boat or whatever, and there's going to be an animal in there that's not a duck. Now, is it a protected species or is it another form of migratory game bird? Many times, Rich and I come, it could be a grebe. It could be something like that. The officer looks at the feet. He knows it's not a duck. And one of the catches is just because it has 3 toes forward with webbing doesn't necessarily make it a duck. There are other birds, for example, gulls, terns, things like that, that have 3 toes forward with webbing. But if it doesn't have 3 toes forward with webbing, it can't be a duck. Point being made. So now, most times we have a duck. From the foot, then we go to the wing, and there's diagrams in this guide that show the wing structure. And the speculum you speak of, Joel, and you put it so well, is the secondary wing feathers. That's that kind of the middle part of the wing. You have the primaries, the outer part of the wing. Then you have the secondaries. Then you have the tertials. There's kind of 3 general parts of the wing. The tertials are closest to the body. The flight feathers furthest. The 10 or so feathers in between, sort of that square patch, is what we consider the speculum. So once we go from the foot, we go to the wing. And the reason we go to the wing first is because whether the bird's in breeding plumage or it's molting plumage, when the males sometimes look like females, the wings never change as long as the feathers have grown. There is a portion of the life where a duck is flightless and you can't see the feathers yet until they grow out again, because they have a simultaneous molt. That could be a whole nother podcast. But if the wing feathers are there, we can tell what species this bird is. Many times, the sex of the bird. Sometimes we need to know that, right? You only shoot so many hen mallards, let's say, in the bag limits or things like that. So we need to know not only a species, but in some species, we need to know if it's male or female.
Pat, Pat, this you introduced some, maybe to some listeners, maybe some more complicated terms, primaries, secondaries, tertiaries. In the beginning of this guide, you guys did a wonderful job, orienting people. So you could have never seen a duck in your life. And exactly. I'm darn confident that you could pick this thing up, read the first few pages. And one of the things I always like is I like people to understand why something is. And so you guys do a wonderful job, kind of laying out the whys and hows of this one. And I wanted to point out how detailed you guys go. This is it's a field guide. It's for hunters and law enforcement alike. It's for the entire continent of North America. One of the funny sections, I think it's kind of funny. There's this also called section. And so I just happened to flip to wood duck. And in different parts of the continent, people may call them something else. They may not understand that a duck by one name is the duck that they recognize. So a wood duck. So these are some maybe slang: woody, Carolina duck, spring duck, water pheasant, or squealer. And I admit I've only heard woody and squealer, but I haven't heard the others. And so it is, I'll call this an every person's ID guide. And then, there's also a similar species if it's, if there's something that you could commonly confuse it with. Under the wood duck here, there's the mandarin duck. And of course, that's going to be a pretty rare sighting here, but you never know. That could happen. So this is impressive. And again, I think we could spend an entire podcast on it, but what I'd rather do is tell people how they can get their hands on it. We want them to get their hands on it for 2 reasons. One, identifying ducks is so much fun. Waterfowl hunting is so much fun. Don't be intimidated by it. It's a pretty easy process if you go by this book. So if you want to get your hands on a copy of it, you can go to Delta's website, deltawaterfowl.org/shop, SHOP. And there's going to be a bunch of stuff, and there's going to be a picture of that guide there. Jump in. If you're listening and you're representing a state or federal or provincial wildlife agency and you think, hey, we'd like to do a volume purchase, we'll work with you on that one. We do want all of that out there. And I would say it's really important is the proceeds from the sales of this book, and this was something built into day one of the conversation, is, everybody wants to.
Let me read it to you.
Okay.
So on the inside back cover of this book, and this is exactly what you'll see. And when I either sign a book to somebody, because I buy it in bulk myself, I buy this book myself, and I give it away as gifts. Service proceeds from the North American Waterfowl Identification Guide will be directed toward habitat acquisition projects with direct benefits to wildlife. That's under the mission of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Under Delta Waterfowl, they will read, Delta Waterfowl proceeds from the North American Waterfowl Identification Guide will be directed toward the programs that support Delta's mission to produce more ducks and secure the future of waterfowl hunting. That, to Rich and I, was almost the most important thing of this book, other than dedicating it to our brothers. It means so much. We don't see a penny of this. I'm not making personal profit, even though I'm retired. Nothing like that. We wanted the proceeds to go half to your agency, Joel, Delta Waterfowl, and half to ours to be used directly for waterfowl projects. And that's what Rich and I are so proud of that. This book, when you get it, I always tell people it's great flipping through the pictures. But read the text. We tried to make it as simple as possible. Again, complicated thing, simple as possible. And then play with the species And this book will be so valuable. Using these characteristics from in hand, valuable to the waterfowl enforcement officers. But as you project those characteristics further and further away through your binoculars, the hunter will be successful at identifying birds on the water or even on the wing in the right condition. Maybe it'll enhance the hunting experience. If you can't identify it on the wing, don't pull the trigger. And it's simple as that. But the book will help make a hunter better at ID, will make the wildlife officer better. Taxidermists will love it. Decoy carvers will love it. The general public, birders. I mean, I've got friends from all walks of life, and they all ask, how can I get one of these books, Pat, one of these books? Because I can't give them away to everybody I know. Mm-hmm. So I give them what you just said, your website, Joel. No one has ever complained. The biologists love it. The wildlife technicians love it. The officers love it. Many states, our National Wildlife Refuge System, Canadian Wildlife Service, they have bought it in bulk for their officers, for the people that deal with waterfowl. People love it. It's part of their library now. And when it comes to those 47 species, there's no other book that covers it like we cover. That's all I can say.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I guess I look back on this podcast, one of the things I'm going to like the most is, you guys, your passion really comes through for the resource, for your job, for the ID guide. One of the things I think, and this is about hunting in general, and I think the three of us are probably really proud of this. When you buy a hunting license, it goes back to conservation. When you buy a duck stamp, it goes back to conservation. When you buy a firearm, when you buy ammunition, when you buy a bow, it goes back to conservation. And so it's appropriate. You buy this book, the proceeds are going to go back to the ground. Obviously, there's printing costs, but beyond that, this is everyone's opportunity to improve their own experience, improve the experience of others. If you give it as a gift, I gave my two kids each one of these for Christmas when it came out. And so it's an awesome opportunity. With that, guys, we covered a lot of ground, and I was holding myself back from other topics that we were, that we may have chosen to go down. We could have you guys as regular guests, and I think we probably will, because you're both fun and passionate. And there were about 50 rabbit holes we could have gone down, and let's make a commitment to go down them, because I think people, one, could be entertained from some aspects of conversations that we could go down, but others educated. And so I really appreciate it. Rich, I know you've been quiet here for the last little bit, but you're the strong silent type, we'll call you, for at least this moment. We'll cherish it, Pat, right? We can get a word in on him.
Joel, let me add this. You go back and remember what Rich said about his dad and his brother, and the size of the family.
Mm-hmm.
And I became such good friends and considered part of his family. It was like running with the bulls. They were all big men, tall, muscular, tremendous men. Running with the bulls. Need I say more? But there's so much more Rich and I would love to share that I think your listeners would get such, information out of, or an entertainment, including you.
I think so. I definitely think so. So guys, I'm not going to give out your personal information other than your name. And so what I'm going to encourage everyone to do is, there's a special email address associated with this podcast@deltawaterfowl.org. If you have any communication, if you want to reach out to these guys, reach out to that email address and I'll forward it along. Won't make any commitments for these guys, but for myself anyway, you always have access to me. Find my contact information on the website, or go to that email address, or go to that email address, the podcast@deltawaterfowl.org. Again, if you want to look at that duck ID guide, go to deltawaterfowl.org/shop, and you can get yourself a copy or gift a copy. Guys, thanks a lot for your time. I can't thank you enough. And I'm going to reach out to you in the not too distant future, and let's get some other dates on the calendar and keep this dialogue going.
Thank you for your time.
All right, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Everybody take care and be safe.
You too.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.